can chat on this by these means.
Yeah.
There's a chat facility on Hangouts. I've got it. Because when it starts, and I can't talk anymore, then I'm going to try and chat.
No problem. Okay.
Thank you so much.
So, because I just want to see what's happening to the sound. So,
Okay, I'm going to cut off here because then we're all, I'm getting new viewers. I'm getting a bit of feedback from
my name is Wolfgang Achtner, and I can hardly see some of you guys because you have the sun behind you, but that's okay. I'm here for the moment.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say the dog ate my homework. Literally today my computer died, so I would have had some notes that I don't have. So if I'm a bit unorganized, please forgive me. Thing is, I would like to address an issue that is very important from Italy and connected to, in several ways, to the major political problems that Italy has right now. And of course, in the end, suggest fairly, how one can try to solve this, because I think it's an issue that is central to proper running of this country in the future. Basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about immigration and the issues that are connected to it, because in Italy, there's a very peculiar situation. Italy is a country where immigration of a certain number of people started much later than in other countries. And here, until the 80s, basically you had a few people from Eritrea, that used to be an Italian colony, a few from Ethiopia, maybe a few Somalis, and then, for example, in Rome, there was a small number of Filipino workers who were usually butlers or housemaids, and there might have been some of them in Milan, but there were hardly any foreigners other than people with international organizations or businesses, and you didn't have anything that resembled migration the way you do today, or already in other European countries. And it started almost invisibly in the early 80s, and around the mid-80s, it became visible, at first through a situation that was tied to people who were called Bukumpra, blacks from Africa, people from Senegal or other countries, who in the major cities and at beach resorts might show up, throw a rug on the floor, and have all sorts of trinkets or stuff they were trying to sell. And they would say, "Bukumpra, do you want to buy?" So they were called Bukumpra. And this was one of the first instances of immigrants being visible, in part because they were all black, and many of them were all tall. So, of course, they were people who wouldn't go unnoticed. And there wasn't really much discussion about it. They were tolerated, but basically nothing happened in the sense there was no discussion in the country. Are we going to have immigration? Not, etc. And then slowly more and more people started arriving, and there were also people who didn't intend to come here, but were political refugees from Eastern Europe. For example, Poland. There was a moment where there were many Poles in Rome, partly on account of the fact that Pope John Paul was here, and because they wanted to escape communism, but they didn't want to stay in Italy. They were people, at least most of them, who got UN protection, and there were like refugee camps outside of Rome along the seaside. And they would be here a few years, and then finally they would depart to the States or somewhere like that. And while they were here, they were cleaning windshields on street corners. So there was a moment, there were these Polacks all over the place. And that was an aspect that was very peculiar, tied, like I said, to a certain moment. And Then the Poles disappeared, and contrary to what happened in Britain, and as well sees well in certain films, they went into the building industry and stuff like that. For skilled workers. Some of them were skilled, some weren't. It didn't make any difference because young Italians didn't want to go work in the factories. And this is a moment when there was a sort of upswing in the Italian industry. It didn't last that long, but things were going rather well, and they needed these people desperately. So they would take them and train them. And also, one thing that happened after a while, since these people in the beginning had no money, didn't speak Italian, and they were not, they weren't welcomed by the Italian population. The businessmen needed them, but the population didn't like the fact that they were there. It wasn't even a question of racism, they just didn't want anyone. So it was very difficult for them to find places. From somewhere in that the left and the Catholic Church said we should open our arms and everybody should be allowed to arrive, and the conservatives and the ultra-right said no, no one should be allowed to arrive. And at one point they passed a restrictive law, but nothing was ever really thought about or discussed. Italy has no foreign language schools that are public for this stuff. It has no integration courses. It has nothing. Things happened on the fly. Some people did better, some did worse. It was a disaster for people who were here as refugees because it took them sometimes 3-4 years to get their application process. And I remember talking to several of them, they would sort of go nuts because they couldn't work. They had no work permit. They didn't know what to do. They would just sit around and pass the time. And instead, in the fields, in the countryside, many of these people became more and more important because young Italians didn't want to be farmers. And of course, agriculture has its rituals, has its cyclic moments, and of course you need people to do work in the fields. And I remember a friend of mine who had a small situation where he had certain vineyards that weren't that big, and he convinced an Albanian family. He had an old building on this property, and he said, look, I'll rebuild it and you guys can live here. If when I need you, certain times of the year, you come and work, and of course I'll pay you. But the important thing is we have this deal. You can live in this house and you don't have to pay me anything. But 2-3 times a year when I need people to do certain tasks, you'll come. And that was a relatively nice situation because more or less everywhere what happened was something that was terrible because a lot of these people didn't have proper papers, so they were taken advantage of. And it's very simple to say they were exploited. They were used worse than slaves, because if you have good slaves, you protect them. And the conditions they lived in were not fit for pigs. Terrible, beyond belief. What is worse is those conditions haven't changed for the better at all. If anything, they've gotten worse. And we're talking about at least 30 years that have gone by, in certain instances 35, 40. And there would have been all the time, all the possibilities for different parts of the system, whether the provinces, the regions, the national level, whatever level, to do something. Nothing was ever done. And for example, I grew up in the summers in a place that's a resort called Rimini, and one idea that I remember that could have applied, they have these so-called camping areas. Now, to me, camping is something, if you're going to do it, you do it the way the Americans do. You go out into the wild by yourself, and that's wonderful. They have these places with cement floors that look like concentration camps, but they had toilets, wash facilities, everything. The thing is, every tent would be next to the other of the trailer, and forget if you were making love to your wife, but if somebody farted, the other guys could smell it. And you know, I didn't ever think that that was the way I'd want to go on vacation. Also, even in the trailers, it seemed like a lot harder work than cooking at home. But it would have been an ideal sort of situation for people who need temporary accommodation. At least you would have had bathing and toilet facilities. It's easy to create some sort of simple bungalow or whatever. It's nothing was ever done. Nothing. No running water, no toilets. People live in cardboard shacks, aluminum siding if they can fence on. It's unbelievable. People in the fields work 10, 15-hour days. Sometimes people die of heat or thirst. There are women also in certain areas. Usually if they're women, they're from Eastern countries, former Commonwealth bloc, Romania. Down in Sicily, in certain areas, Pachina is a place where they're famous for certain kinds of tomatoes that originally came from Israel, but they're now a Sicilian thing. These women are taken advantage of by the owners in the area, and you know they have to accept because otherwise, goodbye job. There are Sikhs, there are people from all sorts over the place, but this isn't just southern Italy where you could say maybe they come out of the Mafia. It's just south or outside of Rome, it's in the north, it's in Emilia-Romagna where unions used to control things. I had people in my extended family that used to go in the summer and do temporary work, and everything was protected in the way it should be. Now you have this sort of exploitation up there. You have it in Trent, all over. And there's no sign of it improving. It is to be said that in part, one positive thing was done. They did a law that is against caporalato, the corporals. The corporals are the guys who hire you, usually in small towns down in the south or anywhere, early in the morning, 5 o'clock at certain intersections, people meet, and the guy, if he likes you, will take you on, and if not, he won't, or you can get an SMS message. And the thing is, people are getting paid either by the hour or by the case of tomatoes or whatever they grow. And if they have to be driven somewhere, they're paying the driver, they're paying for the bottle of water, they're paying for a sandwich. And at the end of the day, they're working in terrible conditions, having to meet quotas for not more than maybe 10 euros a day. They allegedly get paid 25 to 27, which is nothing, but after everyone has taken their cuts, there's very little left. And then what do they do? Do they go home in the evening? I've told you what the living conditions are, so it's terrible. Mind you, this has gone on for so long and continues in part because I think, first of all, the Italians, it is to be said, when Italy had mass internal migration, it was an enormous biblical phenomenon. 3/4 of the South moved to the North, and they moved to places with big factories like Turin, Milan, etc. They weren't welcomed. The factories, Fiat or other companies that took them on didn't prepare housing or anything for them. These people lived in chicken coops. They lived wherever they could afford it. They had very little money. There were big families. They were hated by the people in the North. Italians have always been racist. They used to call me racist when I was a kid in school because they would say, you Americans hate blacks. And I would say, not all of us, but I would say, you're worse because you hate whites. And they would say, what do you mean? And I'd say, well, if you go to Milan and you're from the South, the father would tell the daughter, and these things are historical facts, if I see you with a guy from the South, you might as well not come home. But they were exploited, they were put in very difficult situations when they needed housing, anything, etc. So the industries in the North took advantage, but did nothing, nor did the state do anything to welcome or help these people when they were out. So if they didn't do it for their own, on one hand, why should they do it for anyone else? Of course, with foreigners, I believe there's another very big problem, which I'm going to address right now. And it is something that has to do with Italy's dark side, its dark past, something that here is never faced, never mentioned. Some people know, most Italians don't. And Italians like to describe themselves as Italiani brava gente. Italians are good people. That's the way we are. We are Italians, good people, nice people, meaning we will help others, we will do all sorts of things. It's the furthest possible from the truth. In fact, during World War II, when they wanted to crack down with reprisals in Yugoslavia, where the Italians were just as bad as the Nazis, the scale of killings or reprisals was not the same, but the methods were the same or worse. One general who wrote out instructions said we have to get tough now. Fuck this understanding the people, being nice, etc. No italiano buono, no more of that. Anything happens, you just blow people away because the message has to be there. Italy has never faced its sins for colonial times. Basically, its colony were obtained by massacres. Italy was the first Western country to use poison gas in Abyssinia. But again, mind you, if we go and look at what Britain did or what Belgium did, we would find a lot of disgusting things too. King Leopold killed at least 10 million people in the Congo, and many other millions had their arms or legs chopped off as a warning. But I'm saying everyone has their problem, but Italy has never dealt with it. They've never admitted it. They've never hardly ever talked about it. All the more when we come to World War II, everything has been whitewashed. For example, I was saying in Greece and former Yugoslavia, there were all sorts of reprisals and things. But in what were Italian colonies, Libya, General Graziani killed at least 500,000 people, along with the leader of the rebels, but at least a good 500,000 people there. So Italy has a lot that it would need to face, talk about. In Germany, for example, this was done very late. Adenauer, right after the war, said we have to rebuild, we have no time for this. This created a problem in the 60s where people were pacifists or churchgoers became terrorists because discussion was outlawed. There was the Berufsverbot. You could lose a state job if you went to demonstrations. So they had the Rote Armee Fraktion, who originally were pacifists and Catholics, because discussion was suppressed. But finally, in the 80s, Germany got there. Everyone owned up to the fact that, yes, Germans, even in the villages, knew about the concentration camps, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing of the sort has ever been discussed in Italy. None. Zero. So my feeling is, unless these things are taken into account, it's going to be very difficult to move forward, because one of the things that certain politicians have done, Berlusconi did it 10 years, 12 years ago, when he wanted to win a certain election, he created this big scare of an invasion. And the invasion is always Islamic. Muslims are going to come and take us over and rape and pillage, and blacks are just as good, but it's Muslims that we have to be afraid. So, of course, fear is the easiest sentiment to manipulate. But then again, if you want someone to be afraid, they have to be afraid of someone else, the other. In Germany at the time it was the Jews. Here, like I said, Muslims, but the blacks, Africans, Muslims, African Muslims, all the more. And in the months leading up to a major national election, there were like 500-600 opening news stories on both the state broadcaster and Berlusconi's major network about the invasion that was happening. There was no invasion. After Berlusconi won the election, these stories disappeared. The following year, they had a European election, but there was no need to, bring this up again. Mind you, the Northern League that existed at the time, the party that Salvini belongs to and now calls League because it's gone national, used a very interesting poster of an Indian chief in a headdress and said the Indians allowed the invaders had come in and they ended up on the reservation, so be careful. And of course,
Good point.
Salvini, as always, the guy who's Italy's interior minister, has always despised people from the south, has said the worst possible things. I wish the Vesuvius would take care of the Neapolitans and Etna of the Sicilians. And also, for example, if the 2nd of June is the Italian national holiday, the celebration of the Republic, there's nothing to celebrate. I would clean my ass with the Italian flag and all sorts of things. And then recently he realized he needed them, and they voted for him. Why? Because unfortunately, a majority of Italians are corrupt. And they will go with anyone who gives them something or offers the promise. Now, of course, 5-Star didn't deliver. Their so-called reddito di cittadinanza, that was going to be a sort of payment for anyone who was unemployed, thing didn't appear. It's only a few euros for very few people, so they said, screw you. Mind you, a lot of them came from the former Communist Democratic Party, etc., and it abandoned that. And they all went with Salvini, even though Salvini hasn't delivered his so-called flat tax, which is an absurd thing because it benefits the rich and not the poorer people or the other, and no one understands it, so it doesn't matter. There is the idea that Salvini is the strong man because 5-Star has allowed him to take over the political scene every day. And he changes a sweatshirt and he plays the cop, the fireman, this, that. He goes and acts as acting foreign minister or prime minister, and most Italians think he is, or at least they like the idea of the strong man because most Italians would prefer to be subjects rather than citizens. This is historical because they won't have the duties along with the rights. They prefer to have a privilege or somebody give them, a prize or a benefit, but responsibility, in fact, in Italy, is a concept that does not exist. One of the key problems.
Where do you see this like?
I will get there in a moment, but I just need to explain why it is so big, like this huge thing that has sort of taken over, a body. It's because there is no principle of individual responsibility from the bottom up or down. And if you eliminate that, in a certain sense, it's as though you eliminate the law of gravity, everything would fly away. And of course, add to the fact that, contrary to what one of the uncles of Alessandro Manzoni said, non ci può essere la certezza della giustizia senza la certezza della pena. You can't have the certainty of justice being done if there is no certainty of the punishment. In Italy, everybody is 100% certain they'll never be punished. So of course, add that and the fact that there's no responsibility, you can push things pretty far. I'll just add one other thing because I think it's important to define a mentality. Many, many Italians, if you were to ask them, in fact, I was invited in Sicily to speak on the day that the massacre of Falcone and his bodyguards and his wife is commemorated in a place called Castelvetrano, where the alleged super mafia boss comes from. No one has found him yet, but he's from there. They held on this day a day to proclaim legality. And I said to them, legality is something I'm sure you are all interested in, but it's abstract. In the real world, down here where we live, it's honesty. But honesty is something that exists only if you're honest all the time, especially if it isn't convenient. And I said, what you guys will do instead, if you want something or you need something for your son, or if you'll go ask a politician or somebody for something, you'll give them a bribe or return a favor. And I said, if somebody criticizes you, you'll say, hey, but I need it. The discriminating fact is I need it, or this can be extended to the family, beyond the immediate family, your workmates, your friends, the clan, which academics have called a moral familism, which is the mafia. So the real mafia that cannot be beaten because there is no interest in getting rid of it is this. Magistrates and police forces can tackle organized crime. that mafia. But the mafia that is in a majority, or at least half Italians, they can't. Now, to address the issue, what needs to be done? Well, I'm absolutely certain that unless a major comprehensive discussion regarding Italy's past, Italy's colonial past, Italy's war crimes, which has to do with all these foreigners, because we're afraid to recognize them and we don't want them, but then again, we have a dirty conscience, even though that doesn't stop us from exploiting them, that has to be dealt with. And just to say something, even though immigration has become a mass phenomenon here in Italy, if you were to turn on an Italian television, you wouldn't see them. Everything is falsified. They are hidden. In a TV show, you might find a gay black guy, if we really want to be politically correct. So that way we've tackled two things, gays and people of color. But you won't see them. And the only time Italians will see and recognize and maybe be happy that there's somebody that doesn't look like them, that is black or whatever, is if they win a world championship or they're a big football player like Balotelli, or as a couple of the female relay teams in track and field, they are people who are even born in Italy, but they're accepted only because they're winners. But people are not really happy. Why do we have, black people doing this for us, etc.? And one thing before I get to the fun bit, I lived in England in the beginning of the 80s, and British literature had sort of had a renaissance thanks to the works of people who were second generation like Hanif Qureshi, talking about issues that regarded them. The fact that they and their families were at odds because the old culture and the new culture and the new ways and all these things that then got into British cinema. Along with Chariots of Fire were all these stories that had been in books, so you had a rebirth of British cinema. With very rare exceptions, there is nothing of the sort here. These people are literally invisible. I can only think of one name that has had a mainstream impact here in Italy, is a young man, a young male singer called Mahmoud. He was born in Italy of an Italian mother, but his father was Egyptian, and Italy has this yearly song festival in a place called Sanremo near Genoa, and he won this competition this year. And there are a couple of lines in the song he put in Arabic. He doesn't speak it, he explained, so he had someone tell him what words he needed to put, where how money can change relations or how the family acts, because he was also, in a sense, lashing out at his father who had disappeared, but when the son started making money, was interested all of a sudden. And Mahmoud is the only example I can think of somebody who is involved in the cultural sphere who is someone Italians would know, even though many people criticized him. Oh, what is this guy? Does he work for ISIS? Why did he use those Arab words that no one can understand? And basically, unless this issue is dealt, the exploitation and the rest, etc., won't ever be dealt with. But I think one other thing that is key is that what is happening out there is not just a question of criminal organizations exploiting these workers. It's a question of major distribution chains creating the conditions. Huge supermarket chains pay as little as possible and force the payments down. So the producers, in many cases, barely cover costs, and of course there's very little for the workers. One of the things that would be necessary would be to force these chains to pay them more, which unless they're forced to do, they won't. And if Italians resolve the first major part, then one could address them and say, with the exception of people who can't make ends meet, all it would take to make life a lot better for people, allow the producers to survive, which we need because we want good quality food, etc. People like myself, many in Italy, don't go to supermarkets, but go to a local producer where you know what you get at a good price. And in the same way, I live near Umbria, even though I'm just across the border in Lazio. But these people that have this olive oil making place. We ordered cases and cases of oranges from a guy in Sicily who sent us incredible stuff at an incredible price. So most of the times would be willing to pay a little more than they pay for shit in supermarkets if they knew that the money would actually go to protect the producers and the workers. But today, if you were to say that, no one cares. People just wouldn't be interested in the issue because they say, oh, we don't want to hear about that, and yeah, but they shouldn't be here in the first place. Well, if they weren't, Italian agriculture would collapse tomorrow morning. The same is true in the States. But that they don't want to hear. And also right now, there is a problem that Salvini and others playing on these fears have really pulled out of Italians their worst behavior. People are not afraid of being racist or homophobic or whatever, just like Trump in the States. And there is this hatred against, you can feel it in places, against migrants and anybody who's foreigner for no peculiar reason, but they're to blame for everything. So I think to move forward, which is important, you need to discuss all those issues and go ahead and then make it clear that there has to be more money. But I'm saying, I'm convinced most people, in the same way that I and people I know are willing to pay a little more than certain minimal prices, but to get garbage, because you can afford it, but it's worth it getting a good bottle of wine for a few cents more than a bad one. People would be willing to participate if they thought it really made a difference, but also if they accept as people the migrants and others who are working there. And right now, one of the tragedies is, of course, if you want to make someone your adversary, if you want to make them the scapegoat, you have to dehumanize them. As was done with the Jews in Germany or others elsewhere, they aren't human, they're bad. So it's a very complicated situation, and Italy right now is in a mess, also because it has the worst possible government you could imagine.
No.
As far as I can see. No, it could be worse. Well, actually, I don't know you, but there's one saying I think we could connect on. I remember once something happened under Berlusconi. He had just passed one of his personal laws that would let him out of jail, whatever, etc. And I went to a place where there was a group of students that I had trained and some young girls, and I said, oh, well, if today we've hit rock bottom, we could finally start going back up. And this very bright young student of mine, a guy from Bologna, who has this sort of British humor, he's quick, like New Yorkers when they go with remarks. He said, why? Possiamo sempre scavare. We can always dig deeper. Oh my God, that's what happens here. So, in fact, the gentleman is right, because we always dig deeper here. But I'm convinced maybe we can turn it around, or at least it's worth trying. And in any case, I have no choice other than trying anyway, because last thing I'll tell you very quickly, I'm public enemy number one in this country, because for more than 30 years I've been trying to bring real news to Italy, which no one wants. Some Italians might, but no political force. No one has ever accepted the principle of accountability here. They only have propaganda. So I'm convinced that you can't have a democracy without real news, and vice versa. And Italy has never had it, and is a feudal oligarchy where the people who have power run the country by controlling access to information, instruction, financing, and jobs. So if I haven't given up in my field, because I guess I'm just one of those son of a bitches who is never going to stop. And then one day I'll drop dead. I might as well continue with this other stuff, but that's it. So personally, I hope the country can resolve this and other things, because as you may have seen or know if you live here or if you're Italian, there's no country like Italy. There's nowhere in the world you can go that has as much cultural marvels, monuments. There's nowhere in the world with natural resources, agriculture like Italy. And yet this is not the richest country in the world. And why not? Because the Italians have ripped it apart from the inside on account of corruption. For more than 40 years, half the population at least had jobs in the public sector. They got through bribes and party cards, and 90% of those people never worked a day. They just got salary. So the Italians are the authors of their own demise, and unfortunately, it's connected to the other thing, like I was saying, legal. It's always someone else. They're always waiting for the strong guy or someone who will magically make it happen. And in this moment, when major political parties are putting or opposition, there's no party of the left. It's on. The PD allowed Berlusconi to infect it from the outside with a Renzi, who was like an outside bomb who blew it up. And there's absolutely no opposition. So the only thing that could happen is Salvini takes all power, getting rid of Five Star, but there's no way he and the coalition government or he himself could fall because there's no one else. So it's a tough moment. As the saying goes in China, and now this year in Venice, may you live in interesting times.
So we could have some questions now.
What do you say about the result of the final election when all 5 of the cities just went against the government? And what do you say about Milan that is moving out and just pretty much set up a city-state with their own personal opinions, and the private sector, because that's, you have to listen, the private sector that is really moving into all the public decision, the private sector, and we are not talking about, we're talking about the families, the one that you just, just said, but families are moving into all the making decision of the neighborhoods, of the creating the big city, with all the neighborhood from outside, and the same thing, the integration in Milan based on work. I mean, we have the majority of Partite IVA, they're from the foreigners, and they're completely respected.
They're playing Italian pensions.
And
As Boeri has been saying for years, but no one listens because that's not useful to create fear.
Yeah.
I can.
Tito, Boeri, we spoke to him continuously, and he completely agreed on that.
No, but he's been saying it. He's in the forefront, given his job. He's a very important economist who has been in charge of the pension sector, the state pension sector. There's a difference in Italy between certain major cities and the rest of the country. Certain major cities, even recently in the European elections, had one kind of majority, but the majority of the votes in the country are different. Now, of course, it's also tied to the fact that most people in Milan have jobs or upper level jobs, they're white collars, etc. But there's certainly a fraction. What is very significant is the fact that, for example, what used to be the Red Belt, owned by the Communist Party and later its successors, Emilia-Romagna, Tuscany, is now, with exceptions in Tuscany, totally League in many other places. But as I'm saying, one thing that one would have thought was impossible is the fact that in the South, the League, with the exception of some places, get an enormous amount of votes when Salvini is the same guy who has always trashed these people with enormous ferocity. But as I said, many Italians here vote on interest, and if they think this guy might be able to give us something, we'll give it a try. And if he doesn't, we'll dump him and go with someone else, as they often do. But more than the fact that the League won in the North, it won in the South, where they have always been destructive. But then again, certain things, for example, Emilia-Romagna or Tuscany, were areas where there had been a strong membership in the Communist Party. In the cities and in the farms, the people were all hardcore Italian communists, which doesn't mean they supported Stalin, but Italian-style communism. And they believed in certain values like solidarity, helping the weak or people in the West. All that's gone.
So
that has just been
we
erased.
just bring it back to a bit more of a global, because I'm sure we've all got lots of comments to make about the Italian situation at the moment.
I'm going to leave the politics aside. It was absolutely. I'm going to leave the politics aside. It was absolutely fascinating to hear what you're describing the situation. I could just pick up on one thing because I think it connects to what Charlotte is, focusing our attention on, and that is the market systems, and particularly, I mean, here in a country that produces so much food and that loves food so much, and you've got market systems that are driving prices down, which actually is, those cheap prices are really a masquerade for all kinds of exploitation.
Absolutely, they're one of the major causes.
But, you know, what we have seen in this era of disruption is that you start to see some alternative market systems that are, you know, I mean, you see it in fair trade coffee and so on in Canada and US. I know I've been involved in some of this, you know, with, say, fisheries and trying to disintermediate.
Like those consumer goods and other
systems, sure.
So those are very, for the moment, very small exceptions.
But they can become, I'm trying to say that they can become transformational levers, because rather than just thinking that the lever is always a political system, that sometimes being able to transform, and that's not easy though, I understand it's not easy.
But I think that's also what Daniela is saying, is that you take power away from the political institutions and the administration, which is something that, in a sense, could happen with producers who are beginning to take up a stance against government regulation. So we're going to have someone who's going to be talking about agro-mafia coming tomorrow. We're going to have Terry talking also about taking a case against Nestle. So these are situations where individuals are beginning to look at the way that these structures have been created.
And I totally agree. And all I'm saying is that in this particular moment in time, it is not impossible, where it would have been 20 years ago, for producers to develop their own distribution.
Absolutely, but for example, that's something I was mentioned very briefly that I myself do with others, etc. But on a mass level in Italy, it's very difficult to address these issues when the majority, the absolute majority of people working in the fields are seen as the enemy, the one that the Italians even hate, which are the foreigners, especially the black foreigners, the people from abroad, etc. There is no sympathy with moments, oh yeah, geez, that was terrible, that guy died of hunger, or there was a car accident where there were 15 or 20 of these workers in a small van where they'd even taken the seats off and thought, oh geez, that's terrible. And then 3 seconds later, who cares? No one ever does anything. Plus, they've known about the situation for 30 years. But right now, since they hate them, why bother changing?
So the other thing I think that's interesting is that you're getting, and this is to return it to parallel situations, is that you're getting an abandonment of land as a result of that.
Sure, yeah.
So the environment is suffering, and that means that rural areas are beginning to have all sorts of problems about, this is very much what Katia was saying, that we all talk about going back to the land and doing small-scale farming to save the world, but there's no one here to do it. So we're making literally slaves of people, either in Africa or in our own European countries, where it should definitely be illegal. And even then, we're getting a mass influx of fraudulent products that are going into the supermarkets and the markets and that are pushing the prices down. So it's a very odd contradiction, because you're getting these situations where the amount of money that has been made in the agro-mafia business in Italy now is absolutely massive. The figures are absolutely petrifying. So not only are people being exploited to produce food, but they're bringing in food from countries where people are being exploited in an even worse way.
Like they're bringing in tomatoes from China, putting them in cans and marketing them as Italian tomatoes. But there are other phenomena also. If you mention wine in Sicily 35 years ago, there was nothing except marsala. That was some kind of, Swedish piss. They're fantastic wines, incredible wines. There are Sicilian companies and companies from northern Italy that have moved in and created incredible wineries. All throughout Italy, you have incredible wineries, and all of them not only produce wine. I'll just say one thing that I've learned, I'm not a wine expert, but I've been able to appreciate, is that whereas until approximately 10, 15, 20 years ago, wine was sort of very much, sure, it depended on your vines and where you were, but then if the year was going to be good or bad, you know, who knows what the weather will be like. Now, it's become a science. So you can very much control, I'm not talking about constructing wine chemically, but I'm saying the conditions it's grown in, you can make sure that whatever happens, you have an average decent year. And in the same way, if you take a good vine from somewhere here in Italy or wherever, and you bring it to almost any other country, you can produce an excellent wine. Of course, something that grows on lava or rocky terrains will be slightly different somewhere else, but you have excellent wines in Tunisia, New Zealand, God knows where. Forget, you know, United States they've had for 30 years, but in countries where no one would imagine possible. So there are positive things that are happening. These major wine producing companies are employing people. They're working well. They're one of the success stories of Italy. But it's a small part, and if we're talking about agriculture or food and wine, it's a very small part.
But there is a little bit of renaissance also in like very mass distribution, like the Co-op is creating their own line and is like a B Corp for everything that is producing. So that's a huge thing that is supported by families that go and buy that kind of stuff.
But also certain young people are returning to becoming farmers and doing it in a different way and in a sustainable way, etc. There is also this. But I at least personally feel that until you remove this major issue that has to do with immigration and racism and stuff like that, since it's connected because the people who work in agriculture are part of that, you can't tackle the other issue as well as you could.
But I think you have to change the tone of voice, since, for example, a lot of people don't go in the fields or agriculture, or they don't become butcher, or they don't, because of the wording, and it was like bad jobs, you have to be a lawyer. You know, like you have to change, like there is a new change of
But that's already happened in the same way. If you take all these hill cities in Italy, people used to get out of them because they wanted to have a modern house. Near in the town where I live, you have beautiful old buildings that now have all been fixed up and bought by someone else. And the people live in this shithole place that resembles Albania that they were happy to move into. Even Pasolini said, "What the hell are you guys doing?" But that was something that happened 30, 40 years ago. They wanted to have a refrigerator. They didn't care that, you know, you had wooden beams. They wanted to go something that was new and modern. Now, as I was saying, sure, no one wanted to be a farmer because you bust your ass from 5 in the morning all times of year, wherever you go. Even in the United States, farmers who work on their own that have huge things and have mechanics, they fix everything and they can barely make a living, contrary to what people think. But they're the equivalent of a small farmer here. But now you have many young people who are returning to the land with a positive impact, but also wanting to do it in a different way. First of all, there is no negative vibrations attached to it. If you say you work on a farm or you have a farm, no one thinks you're something like that. They admire you, if anything. And they are also connected very much with ecologically sustainable, biologically produced, good, you know, fruit, vegetables, etc. So that is already started.
I don't, in my experience of 30 years of farming in this area, that actually there was a moment where young people did try to go back to that. They discovered how much hard work it was, how little money they made, and a lot of them just aren't doing it anymore. So there was a surge of that, but then they discovered what it was like. And now, for example, if I try to find someone to have a full-time job, perfectly well paid, legal, everything, who will do the work on the land, can't find anyone. And I know that this is the case. I think that Kasia would know about this. So it is extraordinary that there is a myth that young people are going back to the
Sure, not everywhere. It's a sort of elitist thing for the moment.
No, but can
It's not a mass phenomenon, it's an elitist
But I
phenomenon.
also think it's a lot of,
elitist phenomenon.
Charlotte has to do a lot with taxation. I mean, we are taxed, all manual work and all agriculture was taxed the same way than other things. So it becomes really, really complicated even to make money or to support yourself. I think, we've been dealing with taxation on manual jobs like for forever. And that's one of the subjects that we've been talking continuously about.
And in addition, you're facing a changing climate. The climate is changing and, it is no longer, there are no longer the same certainties, the same uncertainties, but it's entering a whole new phase.
That's going to be a major issue very soon. I was somewhere last year where compared to what used to be normal, they were harvesting the wine 2 months early. And I was somewhere else in the Marques where they have, what's the typical wine? I can't remember. Verdicchio, not hazy, which is inside a valley. And they were saying, yeah, we've already been thinking, years it's raining much, much less than before. There's little or no snow. The glaciers in the Alps have disappeared. All that is connected, of course, with the water. The pole in its bed was completely dry, like you would get in the worst summers.
That's pretty scary. So the other thing I think that Rick is a question.
Sorry, did you? No. Well, I just want to go back to something I think is elusive in all of this, not just you, but I'm trying to connect some things I'm hearing because it was what Katja was saying as well. I mean, if argument.
Otherwise, I don't commit suicide. I'm not.
Confirmation bias, so I'm sure that. What you were saying, it was that until there's a reckoning, an Italian reckoning with the biases and crimes committed by Italians, that there's no moving forward. And I heard what Katja was saying, there is a liberal reckoning. Two other examples, but there are only two that I know of where this, one by Václav Havel, Czechoslovakia, when it was and his inauguration, he wasn't waving the flag of victory. He was all complicit. This is wrong. And we won't be assuming our power. And Nelson and the Maasai have just done. But it is and politically powerful. Required is solidarity, is to see all of the problems can be blamed on others, but until the group cannot achieve. Right?
Talking about South Africa, colleagues, whenever we talked about it, we had always been bloodbath. That sooner or later, and all the whites were going to get wiped out. Thanks to the enormous charisma and respect, but they did a different kind of reckoning. I don't remember the exact name of the tribunal, where people had to admit crimes even they had committed, and then it was
reconciliation.
Exactly. But I even heard people talk about terrible things. under, you know, a vacuum. And what happened within the Democratic Party, people wanted change. They would have voted for Renzi's dog, and he presented himself. All these people, many of whom were interested also in their own personal interest. Or who will do what they're told. And that's the problem. The Italians who are really creative, where people are doing great stuff, are doing it in their own industries, in their businesses, but you don't have that kind of people running the country. The so-called, what would you call it? Not ruling class, what is the word?
Elite.
Yes, elite in general, but la classe dirigente, you say in Italian, you know, the guys who have to make the decision for it, it's total crap. I mean, most people here are illiterate in the government, and they believe that that's what you want. And I would say, okay, well, you know, next time you need to go to that, I have a friend who's a veterinarian, or actually my butcher friend, he's great with a knife, he'll take care of you for free. And they say, are you crazy? They say, why? You need a surgeon who knows what he's doing, but the country can be run by someone who hasn't gone to 5th grade. You know?
Ladies and gentlemen, dinner.
Oh my God.
We're going to want to do words, and I think Shakespeare said you can't eat words.
Just a question, Cheryl, are we supposed to bring our glasses?
I think that's a good idea. We've got other glasses, but bring your glass. And conversation continue at the table. Because that is part of the symposium.